After doing my research on menopause, which continued, of course, after I'd written the book, there was more work that followed on. But I went back again to Japan some years after to undertake another major project. And this was because I was reading in the Japanese newspapers that there was great concern in Japan about organ transplants and the recognition of brain death. Because as you know, in order to procure organs from, you can procure kidneys obviously from living donors, and you can procure little bits of liver from living donors, but you certainly obviously can't take a heart out of a living donor. And in order to be able to procure hearts and do heart transplants, it was necessary to declare the condition of, or to determine that the condition called brain death was equivalent to the end of human life. In other words, it was determined through testing that there was no possibility of any kind for recovery, and that the only thing that was keeping these people, these dead people, going was the ventilator. And in the moment you stop the ventilator, then complete heart death would follow right away. And so it was perceived very quickly by the medical world that this was an opportunity to promote organ transplants in a way that hadn't been possible. Kidney transplants had been done for quite some time, and they had developed immunosuppressants and were getting better and better at it. But now they saw the chance for doing organ transplants. And some of that was very nasty at first, with the very famous case, of course, in South Africa, where the Christian Barnard case, he was a shocking doctor who a friend of mine knew quite well, who would come and try and steal patients and so on. But after the original problems, it mostly became routinized in North America and in other countries in Europe, although not everywhere. The Danes and the Swedes took a long time to routinize and accept the idea of brain death. And in Japan, where they have all the technology and all the skills, there was a massive, massive resistance to the recognition of brain death as the end of human life, because as far as the Japanese were concerned, whether they were doctors or lawyers or ordinary people, while a body is still moving and apparently breathing, even if it's aided breathing, but things are circulating around the body, as far as everyone was concerned, this meant that that person was still alive. And so brain death was not recognized in Japan until the end of the 1990s, and I think it was 1997 when finally it was recognized as being legal to procure organs from a brain-dead body, but only after a massive mobilization throughout Japan, trying to explain to people and educate people and get people to change their minds. And they did have to get a sort of consensus before they went ahead and changed the law, which they did. So finally they were able to procure organs, but then there's the question of, are there going to be donors? You can have your relative in a brain-dead state, but you don't agree to donate. And so one of the very interesting things, going back to what we've talked about earlier, is that the decision to donate in North America, of course, is an individual decision, and you sign your donor card or whatever, and the family will presumably, almost without doubt, agree to go ahead. Obviously, it gets difficult when it's an infant or a demented person. There are difficulties. But on the whole, someone is killed in the road by a car, and the family will agree to go ahead with what the person has signed on their driver's license. In Japan, that permission to take an organ must be signed by the family, as well as it's not an individual decision. Has to be taken. There has to be evidence that the family agrees that this can be done. So that held things back, and still today the rate of donation of organs in Japan is low compared with North America. Canada's not all that good in this. The Europeans do much better. The Spaniards do the best of all because they have an aggressive program. But the Japanese are still far behind. So this gets into the complicated business of if you're dying and you've got money, do you go somewhere else to buy an organ? And very few Japanese do that. But on occasion, they have actually come to America and received a heart transplant, and there's probably money has changed hands, but we don't know about that kind of thing. It's not in the public domain. And then certainly, of course, in poorer countries, and Iran has been a country that's been involved with this for ages, as far as kidneys go, because kidneys are always wanted much more than any other organ, Iran officially recognizes that the sale of kidneys is acceptable, and they do have constraints on it. But in other parts, particularly Bangladesh and Pakistan, there's trafficking in human organs and a huge amount of publicity about stolen people who are stolen and organs taken from them, and then they're left by the roadside and so on. A lot of this is urban myth. It's not true. But the commodification of organs leads to all sorts of massive, massive problems. So the book that I wrote in connection with this is called Twice Dead: Organ Transplants in and the Reinvention of Death. And this book has sold incredibly well, and it has sold much, much more than the menopause book. The menopause book has sold among anthropologists, but this one has sold in the medical world as well. And all of these books, just about all of my books, have been translated into all my single-authored books have been translated into Japanese, so there are Japanese versions of these too. And the research in here includes interviews with people in Japan who were struggling to decide about whether they should donate or not, and also and the reasons why they did choose not to or not to go ahead, and also the terribly sad stories of people in Japan with somebody who was dying because they needed a heart and they had no way to get an organ for until the law was passed, and even after the law was passed, not enough donors. So there is still rather a high death rate, comparatively speaking, in Japan because of lack of organ donation. But there's massive movements in Japan to mobilize and transform this, and I haven't checked up lately, and it may well be that people are donating much more than they used to, that the next generation has less and less trouble. But all of this stems from what we've talked about already, about different ways of thinking about the body and the way in which the body is a unified whole, and there's no division between mind and body, and the body does not belong to an individual, it belongs to a family. So that's a very, very fascinating story that got played out dramatically differently in these countries. And of course, the transplant surgeons in Japan were terribly, terribly frustrated because they often had trained in North America. Not all of them, but some of them had. And the other thing that came out of this was that the Japanese became extraordinarily good at doing living-related donations. They did this much faster than other countries, where you match with a brother or a cousin or something like that, somebody like that, and you take a little bit of liver and transplant it, or of course a kidney and so on. And the Japanese became leaders in that area as a result of the restrictions within their own countries. So other countries did have problems, as I noted, but this wasn't in the public domain very much. I write about it in that book, but it was something. It was assumed that it was all natural and normative in 5 minutes, that organ transplants would be done here with no difficulties, and it was never the case. It's a very, very tough and moving situation. I've been in intensive care units here and in Japan, and it's just heartbreaking watching a pair of parents, sometimes divorced parents, standing over the brain-dead body of their child, and one wants to donate and the other one doesn't want to donate. And it's just an impossible situation, really heartbreaking thing. And this is, of course, technologies and biomedical technologies move us in this direction. They make things possible, which means it changes our very idea of what is human life, what are human relationships, how we should behave towards each other. Once you get these technologies inserted into them, we all have to start rethinking once again who we are and what our values are. And that example shows it very well. Another related book, edited book, written by my colleagues and myself, Alan Young and Alberto Cambrosio. So this was produced by the department. We're all in the same department. And this book was a 3-day conference that took place at Cambridge in England in 1996. And it took us until 2002 to get this book out. And the participants are very interesting. Really, we managed to pull together a remarkable group of people. There's Paul Rabinow, Vina Das, Patricia Corfert, Anne-Marie Moll, who's at Twente University, Hans-Jörg Reinberger in Salzburg at that time, Rainer Rapp from the New School, and other contributors. So a really remarkable bunch of people around the table. It was very high-powered little workshop, actually, in Cambridge. And everybody sort of remembers that Cambridge was all wet and soggy, and the food was terrible. And we had to stay in one of the colleges, and we had little narrow hard beds, but the exchange was wonderful, so that made up for it. So again, I became inspired to move to yet another area. I'm afraid my career has been characterized by shifting topics. I haven't stuck with one topic right through, as some really good anthropologists do. I have stayed within the framework of medical, well, I don't like to call it medical anthropology, I actually call it anthropology of medicine. And I have sort of stayed within that framework, and and I have, when looking back and thinking about it, always been interested in the way in which biomedical technologies impact on the body and with what consequences. So there is a theme that goes through everything, but the subject matter changes quite dramatically at times. And this, I'm now going to talk about moving into genetics and genetic testing. And again, I first got into this in Japan because I had spotted that, again, there was a very marked difference between Japan and North America in connection with genetic testing involved in connection with conception and reproductive technologies. And the first article, and actually it turns out the only article I wrote on Japan on this topic, came out in this book, which is called Pragmatic Women and Body Politics, and it's co-edited with Patricia Corfert, whose name's come up several times, a really close Manitoba colleague through the years. And this was it came out in a Cambridge series, Cambridge University Press series in medical anthropology, which was a very productive series and went on for a good long time. And this actually, I suppose, is the first book which one could think of as one where I am approaching it along with many of these contributors are people who label themselves strongly as feminists. And I don't do that, but obviously this becomes one where gender is right at the top of the list, and that's what we're all considering one way or another. And my essay in this was to do with, actually the essays are very, very varied. They're not all biomedical technologies by any means at all. There's one by Janice Body on a birth in British North Sudan. Sohia Morsi writing about Egypt. One of the first ones on AIDS in Africa by Brooke Gunfest Scherpf. Karina Keilman, a past student of mine, writing on infertility in Tanzania. Ellen Lewin writing about lesbians in the US. Lisa Handwerker writing about China and the consequences of being childless when they had the one-child policy. Terrible situation not to be able to produce your one child. That's a classic article. And then my own one. And then in Puerto Rico, Iris Lopez was writing about the women's reproduction there and contraceptive use. John O'Neill writing about, doesn't look as though it's about the Canadian North, but I suspect Aboriginal women and environmentalism is there. Pat Crawford herself writing about the beginnings of the breast cancer movement, and a couple of other essays. So this is really, again, this book is still in print. This book won a prize, as did the other books I've mentioned, and is still widely used today. So the article that I wrote in there shows a number of things, but among them are that the idea of adoption in Japan was not, people were not comfortable with adopting a small baby. People who found themselves to be infertile would consider artificial insemination, provided they knew who the donor was, and the donor would probably be a brother-in-law or some reasonably close but not immediate relative, blood relative, but a relative by marriage who would be appropriate and chosen by everybody. And so artificial insemination was acceptable, but adoption was not acceptable. And among the 30-odd women I interviewed, only one or two agreed that they might adopt a young infant. The others all said emphatically no. And to put it grossly, the reason was that you don't know what you're getting. And there's a long tradition of adoption in Japan. And if a family only has a daughter, they marry in a son-in-law to marry the daughter. And he is adopted formally into the family. So there's a long tradition of adoption of adults, especially men, being moved into the family of his wife. And a long tradition of people assuming that is the only way to deal with a family, to keep the family line going, that it's essential for this. But when it comes to adopting an infant, the answer from most people was no, I wouldn't even think of it, because I've no idea what that infant's going to be like. So you have to wait until you've got your handsome man to adopt in before you're going to do it, who has demonstrated that he's not stupid and that he can manage money and all that. Well, the women manage the money, but that he can run a business or whatever it is he has to do, right? So this was a very, very interesting finding. And they also are very uncomfortable about surrogate motherhood in Japan too. And again, as I have mentioned, I haven't followed up on this kind of thing, and things may have changed a bit. But when I was doing the interviews, there were people who would say they were going for a holiday, and they would go to the States and stay there until a surrogate child had been born, but they would always want it to be an Asian physique child. And once it was born, they would come back, and it would all be sort of, you know, here we are, the family's bigger than it was before, and so on and so on. So a very difficult situation to, and these kinds of things kept very tightly under wraps and not talked about. I suspect that is one area that may have changed quite a bit these days, and I haven't noticed anybody else doing much work on that lately, so it's an interesting area. I then was asked when I got back to North America, I can't remember why, but I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts for something or other, probably giving a talk or something like that. And one of the men who was there, who is a neurologist, said that he was starting up a randomized controlled trial, which was funded by the NIH, the National Institute of Health. And he thought he was hoping that I might be interested in becoming part of this trial, not as a subject, but as an investigator. And that because he had been told that he was being given money for this trial, but he had been advised that it would make sense to have an ethnographic or anthropological component on this trial. And when he heard me talk, he came up and we sat down. And my first response was, I have to think about this. And I went away and I didn't say yes. And then I finally decided that I would plunge into this. And what happened was that he had money to quite a big randomized controlled trial, which was taking place in Boston, in Cleveland, and in a third site in North America. And then in the end also ended up in Howard University, which is a black university. So there were four samples in the end. And these people were being tested for what's called the ApoE gene. And the ApoE gene is the only gene, one variation of which can increase the risk for getting Alzheimer's disease. So the ApoE4, it is widely agreed and widely established with numerous data that it does put people at increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. But, as the epidemiologists are quick to say, it is neither necessary nor sufficient. So in other words, you can have ApoE4, but you never get Alzheimer's. And many people without ApoE4 do also get Alzheimer's. But this randomized controlled trial was to test all these people and see how many of them are E4s and how many of them have other variations of there's only 4 basic variations of the ApoE gene. And then link this to the history of Alzheimer's in their family. And also the ethnographic part was for me and my research assistants, who I brought down from Montreal, and we would bundle into my car and we would go hurtling down to Boston, and I think we flew to Cleveland. And Case Western was at Cleveland. There was the Boston site, and I'm completely blocking what the other initial site was. Anyway, we got in the car and drove, hurtled down there and stayed there for 2 or 3 days and did lots and lots of interviews and so on. And what was very interesting is that overwhelmingly when we interviewed these people after they had been tested, after they had been given the result of their genetic test, and they had also been given, written on a piece of paper, what the estimate of their increased risk was for getting Alzheimer's. And all of these people had learnt that their increased risk, if they had the E4, of getting Alzheimer's was not all that elevated. That it did make it more likely that they would get it than other people, but really they would be well into their 50s or 60s before they were likely to, or in fact they would probably be older when it finally hit, but it would hit a bit more often than among people who didn't have this particular variation. So they all knew this, and we went round talking to these people, and I can't tell you how many of them said to us, yeah, I had the test, I can't remember what they told me. They gave me a piece of paper and they wrote it all down and I put it away somewhere. I don't know where it is. And we would say, what was your increased risk? Do you remember? No, I think it was up. I think I had the good gene, or maybe I had the bad gene, or so many of them said this. And one of them I always remember, and she said, if I ever had to tell my children about this, she said, I wouldn't know what to say. I wouldn't know whether it's worth telling them, that it makes any difference to anything or not, right? And a lot of these people had people in the family who had died of Alzheimer's, because one of the conditions for being enrolled into this trial was that they had at least one family member. Some of them had 4 or 5 family members who died of Alzheimer's, but they were still very casual about these genetic tests. And the long and short of it is that they, by a huge majority, they all believed that lifestyle was more important than genetics, and that living, doing your exercise and eating well and having a social life was so much more important than whatever your genes were. And so the trial, from the point of view of the researchers, proved to be a failure, because they didn't get all these answers that they thought they were going to get about people being anxious about their genetic type. They just didn't, it didn't happen. And it was because the people being interviewed were much too sensible. And they all knew, and they had all been taught, that the gene does not cause the disease. And they all accepted that, and they all believed that lifestyle was so much more important. So it was a really, really very interesting study. So that eventually got me into doing much more work on Alzheimer's, and also more work on genetics. It also got me roped into being a co-editor on this book, which is called the Handbook of Genetics and Society, because together with my research assistant, we wrote quite a number of articles on the findings from that trial, the ethnographic findings. So, and this is now currently coming out in a whole new issue with completely different editors, and I have now been asked to make, rather than being an editor, I am now a contributor, and I have to write a contribution on epigenetics by January the 10th or something. So, and of course, genetics is here to stay. Everybody's still very, very interested. Another related book, to some extent, is this one called Remaking Life and Death, another edited book towards an anthropology of the biosciences. And this I co-edited with Sarah Franklin. And this was pulled together at a workshop that took place at the American School of Social Research in Santa Fe. And again, this is another feminist collection. I think every single author except for one are women in this book. And they include incredible pieces by Raina Rapp and Lynn Morgan, Donna Haraway, and others. And the topics range from cell life and death, genetic testing, embryos as laboratory material, cloning of mutts, written, of course, by Donna Haraway, mutts being dogs, right? Or dogs without a breed, right? Cloning of mutts. my article, it seems, was about brain death, because brain death is down here. So, and this was published in 2003, and this is still very much out there and is used.